Welcome to the Workplace Podcast. We've got an incredible guest today, and I'm really excited for the insights and ideas they'll be sharing. There are so many practical learnings from the conversation that will make a difference to you, your team, or organization. If your organization is interested in a workshop on this topic of the podcast, feel free to get in touch via our website, yellowwood.ie. If you want to support our podcast, and you'll find a link to our Patreon in the podcast description. Thanks in advance for listening and your support. Now, let's take a different path to success. Welcome to the Workplace Podcast. Joining us today to discuss her book, The Conflict Pivot, Turning Conflict into Peace of Mind, is Dr. Tammy Lenski. Since 1997, Dr. Tammy Lenski has worked with individuals and organizations worldwide as a mediator, executive coach, speaker, and educator. Her work centers on addressing conflict in ongoing personal, team, and business relationships. Tammy has mediated thousands of private, court-affiliated, and online cases, and she was in eBay's first group of online mediators in 1999, and on the first panel of probate court mediators in the US. She is the co-founder of the world's first master's degree program in mediation. She has taught on conflict resolution and negotiation in 4 university programs. Tammy holds a BA from Middlebury College and a master's and a doctorate from the University of Vermont. Prior to her ADR career, she was a college vice president and dean. And in 2012, the Association for Conflict Resolution recognized Tammy with the Mary Parker Follett Award for innovative pioneering work in the field. Her 2 books, The Conflict Pivot and Making Mediation Your Day Job, has sold more than 50,000 copies worldwide. Dr. Tammy Lenski, welcome to the Workplace Podcast.
Oh, thank you, William. I'm really happy to be here with you.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about this book, The Conflict Pivot. Now, the reason I like this book, and I was discussing this beforehand with you, is I have been studying conflict negotiation, resolution skills for many years now. I have learned so much from this, and our listeners will do so too. And the reason I like this is the key concepts, which we'll talk about later on. I love the conflict hooks, the stuck stories. We'll go into that in more detail. You've lots of educational stories of actually how you do that, and you have worksheets, and you have a Q&A at the end, and you have a summary. This book is jam-packed with it all. And I love how you make conflict resolution so accessible to people. So there's my compliment about the book, Tammy. And it's great to chat to you again. And let's kick off with what you say in your introduction, Tammy. You say you're a professional conflict resolver. So let our listeners know then is why is the pivot and the conflict pivot's so important, especially when there's roadblocks when it comes to conflict, because we can't sometimes see a way out, isn't it?
Mm. Well, before I was a conflict resolver professionally,
Yeah.
as you mentioned in my bio, I was a university dean and vice president, and I had to, as part of my job, deal with a lot of behavioral things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Students' behavior, faculty behavior, administrators' behavior. And my master's and doctoral work was largely around behavior and what prompts behavior change. And so I came into ADR both as an educator, someone who thinks about how to help people learn
Mm.
things and make use of them, but also as someone with an interest in behavior. And one of the things that we know about human behavior, it's just part of the human condition, is that there is often a gap between what we know and what we do.
Mm.
And a lot of what happens for conflict resolution that makes it hard is that gap. We live in conflict, we're like sucked right into that gap. We might intellectually have some ideas about what we should do, but there are all sorts of emotional things that are going on when we're in conflict with someone, even minor, mild conflict, that make it harder to access the things we know. So the book sort of had its genesis in my thinking about how do we help people? How can I help people inhabit that gap better? avoid some of the common traps that come with conflict, the traps that you see in your work and I see in my work all the time. That, there are very common human habits around conflict. How do we break through those? How do we have a framework that is memorable? I said in the introduction to the book, as you'll know, that in one of my classes, I had a student who said, this is a fabulous book. And he held up a well-known conflict resolution book that I was using as a text. And it is a brilliant book. And he said, this is fabulous. I love this. I love everything in it. But when I'm in conflict, I can remember maybe three things that I need to do. What should those three things be? And he said that right around the time as I was starting to think about writing this book. And I thought, that's right. What are the three things we should remember? So I was really trying to distill it down into something
Yeah.
that we can grab onto when we're in the thick of things, and that we can use when we're separated from the thick of things to think through without feeling like we have to digest a minor Russian novel in doing it. And then I guess the last thing that's on my mind about the book is that conflict takes our agency away. It takes our
Mm.
sense of our agency. It doesn't actually take it, probably, but it takes our sense away that we are in control of our destiny. Because the person we are in conflict with, and the reason it's conflict, is that they are now having, it feels like, some say in what happens for and to us. And so, I see people in conflict handing over way more of their agency than they need to. And I want people to understand what they have still in their own control of their own destiny that they can act on. Perhaps not everything about the conflict, but more of it than they may realize around what happens from here forward. So all of that behavioral stuff is what was going on as I started to draft and write this book, and what largely prompted it.
Let's just build on that point there, right? Because
Mm,
this is what happens to people. And listen, it happens myself, if I'm honest, and it happens
me
to
too.
all of us, is we start blaming the other person. Well, they
Mm,
should do this and they should approach me and this is what they should do. And that's what the point that you make in the book. I think it's a
mm.
fabulous insight is that's where you're given power away. That's your personal agency, isn't it?
It is. It is. I find that there are sort of two camps of people. Well, a very large camp is the people who say, well, it's their fault in some way, and
Mm.
put a lot of it outward. And then there's a somewhat smaller camp of people who say it's all my fault. You know, blame, I'm going to just mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa.
Yeah.
And, as with so many things in life and when conflict, the answer is not at either extreme, it's somewhere in between. But when we make it about their behavior, what they will do, what they won't do, we hand over some of our agency. When in fact, if we can pivot
Mm.
and make it less about their behavior and more about why that behavior is challenging us. Again, this is the behavioral person in me. What inside us is getting hooked? In the language of the book, I call them conflict hooks. What is getting hooked by what they did or are doing? And when we begin to discern that, we begin to unlock a lot of possibilities for ourselves that were kind of invisible before.
And this is where, you talk about the three conflict pivots will achieve one of two things. One is to truly let go and move on. And then the other one is to precisely know what you should discuss with the other person so that the resolution is really between the two of you and within your grasp. Sorry, I paraphrased at the end there.
Mm,
Um, so it does achieve a lot, doesn't it? Because some people say, well, why bother?
mm, mm. I mean, the book ultimately is about how do you find your peace of mind again? People want to resolve conflict, not just to resolve conflict, but they want to get their peace of minds back. If they're in HR, if they're a business owner, if they're a manager, they want to help their staff get their peace of mind back so they can attend to their work. I was on a think tank here in the US, in the state of Massachusetts and around New England for some years. And part of that, I did some research into what percent of time managers feel like they are spending on other people's conflict. It was upwards of 40% in a lot of cases. That's an enormous amount. And I remember when I had a staff and $1 million budget, I remember feeling like some days I felt like I just walked around with a fire extinguisher, right? So when we are mindful of who your audience is, we're spending an enormous amount of time when we can help them approach it differently. We can shift the direction it's going, which is the whole idea of a pivot. When I think of pivot, I think always of a basketball player. Basketball is huge in the U.S. My husband likes to play basketball, and a pivot. I always picture a basketball player dribbling the ball and then abruptly taking it and pivoting it. So the idea is to make a purposeful change in direction so that you achieve a different or better outcome from where you are if you'd stayed here. So that's where the pivot idea comes from and what I mean by it in the title. And now the three pivots, and you summarized them, I'm going to say them again. The first one is to pivot away from what I call your stuck story. And we can
Yeah.
go into that a little. Pivot away from your stuck story and toward its message. And that's a really important piece of information. The second pivot is to pivot, and we sort of previewed this, away from their behavior and toward your own discomfort. Because again, there's something in there really important for us.
Yeah.
And then the third pivot is to pivot away from the past and toward the now and into the future. Because conflict, when I talk to people who are in conflict, and I know you've had this experience, they want to spend a huge amount of energy talking about what happened,
Yeah.
and endlessly in some cases, and it's for professional mediators, professional coaches. One of our jobs is to help them figure out what to do with it.
Yeah.
It's not like the past isn't important, it's telling us something, but
Yeah.
but endlessly dwelling on it is useless in a lot of ways, because it keeps us aggravated. It actually can heighten our sense of aggression. It can do all sorts of
Yeah.
really terrible things for us. And to figure out, so what do I need to excavate from that to move forward? And so that's the third pivot, is largely around that, in a way that doesn't solely rely on what the other person or persons will or won't do.
So let's go into that stuck story as well. I thought that was such a good thing, because that's what's keeping us stuck. That's because we're stuck in conflict. We can't move on. We can't progress with our relationship.
Yeah.
And what I liked about that was the movie trailer analogy that you use. You're
Mhm.
using it over and over again. And the more that we looked at that movie trailer, the more we get sucked into the stuck story, the more day we get entrenched in conflict and we get a fixed position then. That's my understanding. Can you just tell us a
Yeah.
little bit more about that stuck story, and what are the traps people might fall into?
Mm. So the stuck story is the story we tell ourselves, and sometimes others, often others, about what happened. So after we have an interaction with someone that has been bad, or multiple interactions with someone that have been tense or highly conflicted, the whole spectrum, we go for a run and we're thinking about it, and we're starting to form, we sort of replay pieces of it. We're in the shower, or we're at 2 a.m., we're laying in bed and we're thinking about it. We go into a colleague's office and we shut the door and say, oh my gosh, I just had the worst interaction with William. Can I tell you about it? We
Yeah.
go home, we tell our partner, we tell our mother, our sister, our adult child, whatever, and we start polishing, not deliberately. This is
Yeah.
normal human behavior. We start polishing this story the more we tell it. And we know from the way the brain functions that the more we replay something, the more it feels like the truth, because we've created essentially a little neural pathway. It's like a little uh, path through the woods that we've worn down simply because we've done it again and again and again. And so that story starts to feel like the truth about what happened. And we lose track of the fact that really it's a construct, it's a story we've made up in our heads in an attempt to understand and explain what happened and why it happened. And that gets us absolutely stuck, because if that becomes the truth about what happened, then, and they have their truth about what happened, which I guarantee you
Yeah.
will be a very
Yeah.
different story, or at least subtly different in important ways, never the two paths will meet. And it gets very difficult. And a lot of that is all the sort of junk that goes along with conflict. And junk, I don't mean to downplay it, but to impart the idea that it's messy and complicated, all the
Yeah.
emotional stuff and the way and the cognitive biases and all the things that
Mm.
the way we think about things and get conflict tangled. So the idea of a stuck story is to recognize that we have a stuck story, that we've essentially created our own stuck story, uh, and that it's only one way of understanding what happened. And it's an important story. It is not unimportant. So the idea isn't to say, oh, you just have to let that stuck story go. Let it
Yeah.
go. It doesn't matter. It does matter, but it matters in a very specific way. And that's because it's trying to deliver a message to us. Our minds are stewing over it because there's something really important in it. That's what we need to look for, not keep going over and over and over this stuck story and making it more stuck while we're doing it.
And when I was reading the book then, and you go through different stories like that in the book, I was thinking about people when they talk about conflict is get your story straight, whatever you do. Tell yourself it again.
Yeah.
And the more you do that, it's actually probably not the most helpful thing because you're just replaying that. And the other thing then is people will say, well, the facts will speak for themselves. The facts are the facts.
Right.
And then we get
Right.
stuck and then it's those cognitive biases that we were
Mhm.
saying. And then another thing that you said in the book is, oh, we'll tell our friends or something like that, and they'll agree and go, you're dead right. You know what? And you have every right to be angry and you have every right, to do this. And that kind of is unhelpful too, isn't it?
It's very unhelpful. And the friends we tell are the ones we know are going to say, oh, that's terrible. I can't believe William did that. Oh, I'm so sorry. They're not going to be the ones who say, really? Doesn't sound like William. I don't believe you. They're going to be the ones, for the most part,
Yeah.
unless we've gotten smart about it, who will help us soothe our egos and help
Yeah.
us. But we're not doing it from that deliberate way. We're doing it to
Yeah.
understand. We're also doing it because in the workplace in particular, although this happens in families too,
Yeah.
we build up the figurative army behind us this way.
Yeah.
We seek out the people who don't care for William, and
Yeah.
who are going to say, yep, just what I would have expected. And it
Yeah.
makes us feel better about what happened because we know we're not alone. Now, and again, it's normal human behavior. It's not particularly helpful for
Yeah.
actually dealing with the problem, um, but it's understandable why we do it.
So this is the Workplace Podcast, and we have a lot of managers listening in here. And if somebody came in to my office or came onto a Teams or Zoom call and started saying, listen, this is what's going on here, and they're looking for me to agree with them because you're there to champion me, but it's also a team member then as well. What language could a manager use to say, well, can you tell me a little bit more about that, or is it how is the other person perceive this? Like, what advice would you give to managers if somebody is going in telling their conflict story or stuck
Mhm.
story, should I say?
Mhm. Well, first of all, let me quote a journalist here in the US named Krista Tippett, who's an independent journalist. And she has this saying that I absolutely love. She wrote the phrase, it turns out that I can agree with your experience, but I don't have to agree with your opinion.
Yeah,
Right. And I always think when I'm the friend at the other end of that phone line, or when I'm the colleague, like a colleague who called me the other day, I can agree with their experience. I can support their experience
yeah,
without supporting carte blanche their
yeah,
opinions about that experience or how they're choosing to interpret that experience. So I always keep that sort of in the back of my mind. The next thing I'd say to a manager or a colleague is probably the worst thing you can do is sympathize. You can have empathy for their experience and you don't have
mm,
to say, "Oh, don't bother me with this." I'm not saying that. But overly sympathizing uh, boosts and continues to soothe and smooth that stuck story. So there is a worksheet that goes with the book. You can use it with or without the book. And William, when I give you my website later, people can
yeah,
find it on there. And managers can keep a copy of this worksheet.
yeah,
And it has some of the kinds of questions that I would ask someone, like I asked my colleague the other day. I would start with saying, well, tell me the story. I'm not saying tell me your story because I don't want to get them touchy about, well, it's just your story. I just tell me the story, what happened. Tell me about what happened. And I try not to let people go on and on. I always say, give me the Cliff's Notes version. I don't know if
Yeah.
Cliff's Notes a thing in
Yeah.
Ireland? Yeah.
Well,
So
it used to be. I think they're gone now.
yeah, I think
Uh,
they're gone now too, because you can
yeah.
just go
Yeah.
on the internet, right? But they were a thing where it's an abbreviated version
Yeah.
of something.
Yeah.
Um, I always say, give me the Cliff's Notes version, not the minor Russian novel version, and because I don't need to, because really I don't need to know their story, except I am listening for certain kinds of things. Then the next question I'm usually asking, and again, answering this from the point of view of someone who's read the conflict pivot.
Mm.
I'm asking them, why do those things stand out for you? What I'm trying to get at is, why did those pieces of the film end up in the movie trailer, right?
Yeah.
Because now I know I've just said don't tell me the whole story, but even if I sat there for an hour and let them tell me the whole story, there are still certain scenes that they've edited out
Yeah.
because they weren't important to them. They didn't have meaning for them. They were so upset they didn't even notice them. There are so many reasons for how information gets filtered in and out. So I'm listening for, why did these things end up in the movie trailer? And so, I'll say to someone, so what is it about those things that is standing out for you? Why are they standing out? Why is that important to you? And when someone says, well, this is important because, I'll say, and why is that? And what I'm aiming for is to help them think through uh, an essential part of the second pivot, which is what conflict hooks might have gotten snagged
Yeah.
in this conflict situation or in this difficult conversation. So, and that's where I'm mining for that. I'm not diagnosing them, not my business. We're all
Yeah.
individuals. And what I would think or feel in that situation isn't necessarily what they would think or feel. But I'm helping them think it through and process, why is that important to me? Why did that stand out for me? Rather than just letting them vent or letting them sort of bleh. I am
Yeah.
helping them think. And that's really the essential job I see as a friend in those kinds of situations, as a colleague in those situations, as a family member. That if I'm going to be helpful in a kind and helpful way, truly helpful to them,
Yeah.
these are the kind I want to help them think it through. I don't want to help them diagnose the other person's flaws,
Yeah.
figure out where the other person screwed up or or how terrible they are as a human that they didn't handle this
Mm.
well. They can do all of that till the cows come home, and it's going to have far less impact than figuring out how to make sense of what happened and then what needs to be done from here forward to uh, try to get back to some kind of stable state.
And that's the whole thing about conflict, isn't it? It's that self knowing piece. And that's the beauty about the worksheets that you have in the book, because it asks you those questions. And then you just mentioned there the conflict hooks and the snags. So I love that image of a hook getting into my jumper, and I'm not quite sure what's, pulling at my jumper and ripping away. And unless you, as you say in the book, unless you look at that hook and you examine it, go, oh, now I know why I'm being snagged by that. And this
Right.
is where we might introduce the conflict hooks, if that's okay. All right.
Yes.
Because we've
Yes.
mentioned that. Okay, so we have competence, autonomy, fellowship, status, reliability, integrity.
Fracas is how I now remember it. Someone wrote to me after I wrote the book and said, "Here's a sort of an abbreviation that'll help you remember:
Oh,
FRACIS instead of AS for the real word." But
oh,
it's an
well
easy way
done.
for me to remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I ever do another edition, I'll change the order that I introduce them, so there are six total.
I think what it is, it'll be useful then for people then to go, you know what, this is the book for me because I need to read more about this. So especially if I have teen conflict or conflict at home or with siblings or with friends or whatever, or neighbors, it gives that insight to go, okay, oh, this is what it is. And even a few of them, maybe one or two examples of how it shows up in the workplace. So if we
Mhm.
go through the conflict hooks first, and then maybe one or two examples of how it might show up in the workplace. How about that?
Yes. Okay. So first, let me say that one of the premises in the book is that the source of discomfort in a conflict isn't them as much as it is us.
Yeah.
and how we took what they did or said. Now, I'm not saying they are not responsible in any way.
Mm.
I am saying that people can trip into our stuff without intending to. And I can tell the mobile station story, William, if you'd like, but I don't want to lose my train of thought right now.
Yeah.
People can trip into our stuff without realizing it and cause a conflict that they're whiplash. They're like, where did that come from? Because it had
Yeah.
nothing to do with them. But sometimes people can deliberately try to snag us. We say that people press our buttons. The reality is kind of that we kind of press our own. And that's why I don't use the term buttons, because the phrase is so common, at least here in the US, that he presses my buttons. I can't stand the guy. It externalizes it far more than I'd like. And as you pointed out so nicely, the self-awareness part of conflict, I think, is where we have the greatest leverage point to
Mm.
begin to shift something, even if they need to do some stuff too. If we can manage ourselves, if we can keep our center, if we can keep our wits, and we can figure out what our source of agency is and what this is really about, then we have like all the keys to the kingdom for helping in
Mm.
the next conversation with them something to change. So I don't use buttons, and I use the idea of a hook. We're just walking by, and something snags our sweater, or we're swimming by, and some people like the idea of a fish hook as a visual of a hook. There it is, and suddenly something gets our attention. So idea for the 6 conflict hooks actually comes from the work I believe it was in the 70s, by a woman who did a lot on intercultural conflict and communication named Stella Ting Toomey. She was an academic. And her work is frequently referenced in other conflict resolution books I've noticed over the years, without her getting sort of credible, without her getting cited as the source. These things didn't come out of nowhere. And I started to become interested in her work, and I started to play with the idea. And I have found that these 6 hooks are very prevalent, and they seem to be accurate across cultures. I always say seem to, because there's no absolute in the world of human behavior. But these are the 6 that tend to show up a lot. So, fracas, fellowship, our normal human need to be included, to be part of something. And if we're in the workplace, it's the fellowship of our team, belonging to the organization. In our family, it's being part of the family, married to or living with our partner, things like that. Are reliability, our natural human need to be seen as someone that others can count on, who will act on what they say they will do and not do. Autonomy, the idea that we have a normal human being to be autonomous, to be independent, to manage our own self. And that's my husband's big conflict hook. C, competence. In Western cultures that I've done this work with since the book came out, C turns up a lot. And it's largely, I suspect, because I do a lot of work with workplace groups. And competence is huge in the workplace, right? You want to be seen as a natural human need to be seen as someone who is capable, someone who can do what who has the ability to do their job or be a good spouse or whatever it is. I, integrity, the natural human need to be seen as a decent person, right? And then status is the last one, the S. And here's the thing about status. When I do a workshop on this idea, I always ask people to, I walk them through a whole exercise in how to identify possible conflict hooks. And then I just get a read of the room. How many have a fellowship? How many have and I get to status, and like one lone person will, raise their hand like I can't believe they're alone in the room. And I
Yeah.
always laugh because I actually think they're the most self-honest person in the room. Status is the idea that we are valued. It's a normal human need to be valued for what we have. Now, in the book, I said things like material wealth, intelligence, something we have that others would like.
Yeah.
I actually, as I've done this work since the book came out, I actually think that it's probably better to think of this as status is the big one. It's the big kahuna, as we'd say here in the US.
Yeah.
It's the one under which all the others fall. And status is really about our status as a member of the tribe,
Yeah.
a member of whatever group that we so desire to be a member of. And that if we have all of these other things, because they speak to our desire not to be run out of the tribe, figuratively speaking. And from an evolutionary
Yeah.
biology point of view and an evolutionary psychology point of view, the idea of our tribal identity has become quite important to understand us as these social beings who not only want to be with other beings, but don't want to get thrown out to the lions
Yeah.
outside outside the walls. So I think status is actually hugely important because the other things feed that. So that's the big six. And a couple of things I'd say about the hooks. The theory is, and I have anecdotally found that to be true in years of working with this idea, that most of us have one or two that tend to be sort of our big ones. Mine is competence, and my husband's is independence or autonomy. We have a new mail carrier, and it turns out he's not been delivering all the mail. He's been keeping some of it and throwing it out, and including a number of our bank statements. And he turned out he was doing this all across the neighborhood. And we noticed because mail that should be here wasn't arriving, and suddenly all our junk mail stopped coming, which in some ways is a wonder, but it wasn't stopping it from being mailed. He was just deciding what was junk mail and what wasn't. And I finally confronted him about it and reminded him it was a federal crime to steal other people's mail, and now everybody's getting their mail. But but I said to my husband, what did he think? We're idiots?
Yeah.
Classic thing to come out of a competence hook person, right? Don't want to be
Yeah.
seen as an idiot. And my husband, who could care less about that part of it, he said, why are you letting that get under your skin? And I'm like, because
Yeah.
I don't have a competence hook. He doesn't. But
Yeah.
boy, you suggested my husband that anybody is trying to tell him what to do or control him or imply that he needs management in some way. He's off to the races. Doesn't bother me so much. So that's one of the reasons why someone says, oh, don't let that bother you. Let that one roll off your back. It's because
Yeah.
they probably don't share your particular conflict hook. So the idea is that most of us have one or two that are big ones. Do you know what yours are?
I think I'm a mixture of yourself and your husband. The autonomy piece, I like to make up my own mind, and that's obviously I'm self-employed. And the other is the competence piece, uh,
Mm,
as well. But there's something that came to mind, Tammy, as you were talking there about um the status, and when you were talking there, what came to me was peer recognition or recognition
mm,
for my efforts or my work or the
mhm,
quality or how I behave. So, or how I show up for the team,
mhm,
and it's
mhm.
not always linked to competency. Sometimes it's the behavior or my leadership style and
Yep,
and this is what sometimes causes conflict in teams as
you
well,
bet.
isn't it? Is that peer recognition that I'm not being recognized for
Mm,
whatever that I do. But then uh, something when you were talking there, you're going to talk about the mobile, the competency when you were trying to pay for your gas. Um, but this one popped into me was because you're a professional conflict resolver. It's that walking the walk and talking the talk piece. Can you just tell us about that? Because I thought that was fascinating. So you overheard from somebody you about being opinionated or something like that. This is a
yeah,
recollection from the book.
yeah. Somebody, somebody met me or saw me speak at a conference, saw me keynote, and then met me afterwards. And I had some strong opinion about something. I don't even at this point. I don't remember what it was about. I do have some strong opinions about things. I'm not neutral on everything in
Yeah.
the world. That would be a really hard
Yeah.
way to live. And he or she said to my colleague, "Gee, I'm really kind of disappointed because, after seeing her speak, I really expected her to be less opinionated." And I was like, oh, it was sort of aghast. Like, am I too over the top? I know I'm from New York, but really, am I too over the
Yeah.
top? But right, I mean, I think you have hit it around all of these conflict hooks in some way speak to our identity. the way
Mm.
we want to be seen in the world, the way we want to show up to others in
Mm.
the world. And that's why in particular in the workplace, when there are conflicts, when we feel like we are not being seen for the person we believe we are, the
Yeah.
competent person or the capable person or the honest person or the person who shows up when they said they would and does the work when they said they would, if we don't think we're being seen in that way, we are often now in conflict with someone. They may not even know we are. We've been rubbed the wrong way. And that's why I think the idea of the conflict hooks is so important for people in management to understand that the presenting problem isn't necessarily what it's really about, for the person. And I'm not even sure that when we're in the midst of tension or conflict with someone, that we're yet sure of what it's about. So the mobile station story. So we had just moved to New Hampshire, the state of New Hampshire, which is in northern New England, where we now live. And we had lived in a neighboring state. And it had been a very rapid move. We had about a week to move very quickly, buy a house, make the move. And normally I'm pretty well organized. I have my wallet, I have my own. Anyway, I pulled into this town at the time had one that I lived in with 5,000 people, had one petrol station, one gas station. And the company is Mobile, Mobil, no E on the end. And at the time, and this is a long time ago, this is like 1999, they had this little plastic gizmo that you could hang on your keychain and you could wave it at the pump and it would take the money automatically out of your bank account. So I pull into this gas station. Oh no, I'm on empty. Very unusual for me, but again, frantic week. So I was already a little frantic, right? And I reach for my wallet. I don't have my wallet with me. Gee whiz, again, not like me. But I have this key tag on my, it's called a speed pass. I had it on my, great. So I get out, I wave the little thing at the light on the pump. Pump doesn't light up. Try again. Try it several times, doesn't. I go in and I wait online and the clerk comes out. I finally get to the front of the line and I say to him, I can't get the speed pass to work pump number whatever two. And he looks at me and he says, it was working a few minutes ago. Now, I say in the book, and I use this phrase all the time, bad Tammy wakes up,
Yeah.
and bad Tammy says, hmm. Bad Tammy is thinking, you think I'm a moron? Now, if I had been not on my worse on my game, the temptation would have been, again, I'm from New York originally. We do not, I've had to temper my sharp tongue a lot living in northern New England my whole life because the Yankee personality is much less intense. But the New Yorker Tammy, the bad Tammy, would have said, oh, I see. Customer service is your strength. You think I can't take a little piece of plastic and wave it properly at a gas pump?
Yeah.
I suppose you would like me to show me how to pump gas too while you're at it. I mean, I could
Yeah.
have really
Yeah.
done that, right? I didn't do that, fortunately. I was teaching in the middle. I was in the middle of teaching interpersonal conflict, one of the graduate courses I teach. And I teach about the conflict hooks in this class. And I said to him, what do you mean? And preparing to hear, well, I don't know why you can't do it. And what
Yeah.
I hear instead is, that pump is the bane of my existence. It's working and then it's not working. It's working and then it's not working. I bet when we
Yeah.
go out, it'll be working just fine. And as he's going on, and he's really going on, I realized this was absolutely nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
This was all about his
Yeah.
problem in the day. And he was not trying to insult me. He was not trying to tell Miss Confidence Hook that she didn't know what she was doing. And so instead of, I could have given him a tongue lashing. He probably would have wondered what the heck he'd said that made him
Yeah.
deserve it. But instead, I was able to say, oh, so when I go outside, it'll probably be working. And indeed it was. Poor guy, he still had the problem. But I was able to walk away from that, not having created a conflict that didn't
Yeah.
exist. Now, and that's one of the beauties of conflict hooks. When we're familiar with our own, we know the traps. We
Yeah.
know our tendency, if it's one of our, particularly one of our top two our ears hear things differently than someone who doesn't share that conflict hook will hear
Mm.
it. And so we can actually create conflict and problems where none prior existed. And one thing I didn't say earlier, William, is I started to say that we all have one or two big hooks, but the theory is that even though we all have one or two, any one of these hooks could
Yeah.
have an impact on us. It's not like we only have one or two and the others don't matter to us.
Yeah.
Circumstances and certain types of people and certain people in our lives will trigger sometimes these other hooks getting snagged. So that's the mobile station story, and that's why I always use it because I introduce the idea of how you can lessen conflict in your life when you know how to work with these hooks.
And that's that notion of self awareness, then. And this is another aspect of the book that you talked about, then, was a choice point, that you
Mm,
have choice points there. And this is where the pivots can occur. And sometimes when we hit blocks or something like that, there's a signal to say there's something important here that we need to really look at more, or maybe this is a place where I can stand back and reflect a little bit. But just tell us, our listeners, a little bit more about choice points. What are choice points?
Choice points really live in that gap I talked about, right?
Yeah.
It's between what we know we should do and what we actually do. We have a moment, and often it's a moment we don't even notice, where we can choose to do our usual habit. If I could have given that poor guy a tongue lashing. That is no longer my habit as an adult, although I can fall
Mm,
into it if I'm in very bad circumstances. But the choice, we can make a choice in that moment to do something different, to
yeah.
instead say, why am I getting irritated?
Yeah.
What am I hearing in what he's saying? And that asking ourselves, checking in with ourselves in that moment gives us the chance to do something different than the habit thing that may not serve us well in general, or it may not serve us well with that particular person, or it may not serve us well in that particular kinds of situation.
Is it okay if I quote a passage from page 21 in the book? So this is about the third conflict pivot, is to stop
Mm,
focusing on the past, attend instead to where your freedom lies in what you do now. Conflict thrives in the unknowable past. Who said or did what? Who's to blame? What really happened? As you said, memory is very unreliable. Conflict also thrives on your reliance on the other person to set things right. When you
mm.
rely on the other person to change what he or she is doing and connect that person's actions to your happiness, you hand over power. And I love that about the third pivot. It's taking back power, and this is where it brings into a couple of different aspects. Then, where you talk about two things. Then one is self-distancing perspective, which I love. That it's kind of like, how do you step away to be more objective, and
Mm,
identity quakes,
mm,
because you went into the identity quake there a little bit, isn't it?
mhm.
Is that whole
Yes.
notion where we don't tend to look at ourselves, our conflict identity, isn't it? What is it about this hook that's really dragging us into this? Um, and I love this quote from Kotler then again. So this is on page 71, right? Every person you fight with has many other people in his life with whom he gets along with quite well. You cannot look at the person who seems difficult to you without looking at yourself. I love that. So there is that invite,
It's
isn't
one of
there?
my favorite quotes in the world. Yes. Yeah.
And
And it's one of the reasons I don't use the term difficult people. And I don't even really believe, is there a difficult person on the earth? Probably. Are most people with whom we have difficulty difficult people? Probably
yeah,
not. They may have some difficult behaviors, but
yeah.
not everyone in the world thinks they're difficult. Yeah.
And here's the thing is, other people, they seem to be getting on fine with other people. So what is it about how I show up and how they show up to me? And it's really knowing, is it that once you understand yourself and once you're able to view that person in a way of the conflict hooks or whatever that's jarring for you, is that where the peace comes from, that you're able to make peace with the behavior, or is it you're able to make peace with the situation? Where does the peace come from?
Peace comes from finding a different path from the one you're on for
Mm,
resolving this.
yeah,
And if you've done your homework, your self work, and you understand how this ate at you, what
yeah,
conflict hook it hooked of yours, you begin to understand what this conflict for you is about. And your peace comes from, if you are still in regular contact with that person, and beginning to understand or guessing what might be the conflict hooks that it has pulled for them, and being able to explore that. I have some workplaces who passed out the book when it came out so that they would all have a common language around it, right? So at a team
Yeah.
meeting, there's someone over on the seacoast here in New Hampshire who texted me and said, in a meeting today, someone said, "Oh, John, that's just your conflict hook speaking." And she was like, and it was. It was so funny
Yeah.
because it gave them a way to say, "Oh, wait, it's not the toilet paper roll going over the top or coming up from, it's
Yeah.
something else. It's something else." So that's where the piece comes from. In the book, I talk about a manager, and this was a real case that I had, and it was a woman who had been hired to be part of a team, uh, and they had their prior manager had team leader had been beloved, had moved on to it, had
Yeah.
retired, I believe, and this new person came in from another organization entirely, and things went south very, very quickly. Within about a week, there was tension, and the
Yeah.
tension was very particularly between this manager and two of the team members, although the other team members were feeling it pretty thoroughly too. And this went on for months, of course, before the workplace contacted me and said, "Look, we brought her in because we think she has all the right set of skills. We know those folks have the right set of skills. They've been doing their jobs well for years. We really don't want to have the chaos of having to rehire, but we're prepared to do that if we cannot sort this.
Yeah.
Can you see if you can figure out what's going on?" And I went in, and I don't always say, "Oh, conflict hooks, they're the answer to
Yeah.
everything," because I don't think
Yeah.
that's true. Humans are far too complicated for that. There are a lot of other ways to understand and work with conflict. But it ended up, as I listened to her, I asked her the question, sort of, where did this start? And often people don't even know because it starts out so benign,
Yeah.
just one little drop in a puddle and then another
Yeah.
drop and then another. But she knew. She said, "I can tell you exactly when it happened." She said, "I've been on the job just for a few days, and I was coming around the corner and I heard them talking, and it was these two, and saying, 'Let's go to the pub tonight. Let's all
Yeah.
go out as a troop.'" And no one then asked her.
Yeah.
She did not get the invite. And I thought that was interesting. And I spoke to the other two, and they didn't even really remember it. They said, "We don't remember that conversation at all." But what they did remember is that she had been very upfront about how busy things were at home because she was not unpacked. She was in a condo and there were boxes everywhere, and she just needed her space in the evenings to get sorted.
Yeah.
And so their best guess was, "We think maybe we were just trying to honor her clear boundaries." So
Yeah.
I went back and said that to her. And because we weren't yet working together, this was sort of all the
Yeah.
pre stuff that I
Yeah.
was doing with folks. And she said, "Well, I don't believe it. I think they're just making an excuse for their bad behavior." And I said to her, "Well, what was the impact on you? Why did that even matter to you?" I said, "For
Yeah.
example, had I heard them and not been invited, I might have said, 'Hey, I heard you talking about the pub. Can the new kid on the block come?'"
Yeah.
That's what I would have done, inserting
Yeah.
myself as a New Yorker. And I said, "So you didn't?" And she started thinking about it. And it turned out, with lots of reflection on her part, that she had a really strong fellowship hook.
Hook. Yeah.
And she actually had left her prior job because she had been excluded from this sort of informal senior leadership group. She was in senior leadership, but the president of this organization, the CEO of this organization, had an informal, smaller group of the senior leaders
Yeah.
who they relied on as their best sort of advisors. And she desperately wanted to be part of that group, and she was never part of that group.
Yeah.
And she felt excluded. And so
Yeah.
she thought, if they don't care about me, if I'm not going to be part of this inner circle, I'm going to go find someplace else. And what does she do? She comes into this new workplace, and right from the get-go, she
Wow.
decides she's excluded. And I ended up working with her individually around some of this stuff, and then we worked collectively to make sure that um, they could talk about this kind of stuff together and
Yeah.
understand what was important to them and how others saw them. And I don't frame it as, here, let's talk about all your inner stuff, because people don't
Yeah.
want to do that in the workplace. But they do want to talk, given the opportunity, about how they want to be seen. Who is the person they want to be seen as by their
Yeah.
colleagues? And some places people would not have enough trust with one another to have that conversation, but I was able to work with them to develop that,
Yeah.
so they were willing to talk about this forever. And it actually ended up in a very positive place. And she
Yeah.
ended up staying on, and they got this stuff out. But it's an amazing story about how she's the one in that case who really needed to pivot in terms of how she was interpreting the things
Yeah.
that she had experienced, that then caused her to to be tense and distant, which they
Yeah.
noticed that she was tense and distant. And so
Yeah.
they didn't want to get any closer. So what happened? They excluded her more because,
Yeah.
and then she would hear them whispering in their offices. And so she's being excluded. It's this
Yeah.
awful self-fulfilling prophecy that they could, and they had conversations about, behind the closed door conversations and
Yeah.
the problems that creates and that kind of thing. So the pivot that she needed to make in that third pivot is, from here forward, when she is feeling excluded, she needs to address the sense of having been excluded, and understand what was going on there. And sometimes people are going to say, yeah, we didn't include you, we didn't loop you in on that decision, because
Yeah.
we want to have the
Yeah.
freedom and the autonomy to make those kinds of decisions on our own. So
Yeah.
let's talk about the future. Decisions like that, how do we know when we should loop you in, and how do we know when we have the freedom as employees that have a good track record to make those kinds of decisions and run with them on their own? That's then a fruitful conversation. So that's where the freedom comes from in the pivoting. So it's sort of a long answer, but that I felt like that story might illustrate it a little bit.
I think another famous story is that the long walk to freedom, just to build on that freedom of
Mm,
Nelson Mandela. So
oh
just
yeah,
briefly, just when he was walking out, that the question was asked, why weren't you angry?
yeah.
Can you just
Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton knew Mandela and asked him, um, when you were walking out of the prison gates for the last time, when you were finally being
yeah,
freed, um, you then left, and then you invited some of your former jailers to your inauguration as
yeah,
South Africa's president. How did you find it in yourself to do that? And said, as I walked out those gates, and I could see the gates in the distance ahead of me, and I'm walking, and they're all next to
mm,
me, and I was so angry about all the
yeah,
years of my life that they had taken. And I looked at those gates and I thought, if I carry that anger outside the gates, they will still have me,
yeah,
meaning they would still be imprisoning me. And
yeah,
I made the decision to let that go. Now, that's an extraordinary human that can pull that off. But you think about, most of us aren't in situations of
yeah,
that caliber. If he can pull
yeah,
that off, the human capacity to pull off some of the lesser stuff, especially when
yeah,
we've done our self work, is profound, you know?
yeah. I remember watching that live on TV when I was 12 years of age. It was such a
Me too.
momentous occasion, and to find out the story about that afterwards is fascinating. So
Yeah.
we're going to finish up in the next couple of minutes, but there's two wonderful concepts I really want to talk about: is recalibration conversations and cognitive reappraisals. So let's go
Mm.
with recalibration conversations. What are recalibration conversations? That sounds really fascinating.
So recalibration conversations are the conversations that you decide to have after you've done the work of the pivots. And by the way, for
Yeah,
some pivots that, if you, when you get sort of have facility with the ideas, this is not hours and days and months worth of thinking. It can
yeah,
be a matter of minutes to sort of sort through what's grabbing your attention. Recalibration conversations is my name for the kind of conversation you have with someone who you are in ongoing relationship with. So it may be a colleague, it may be a spouse, it may be a business partner, um, that you want to sort of think out loud about some of these things, that this work that you've been
yeah,
doing, and in some cases that they have also been doing. A recalibration conversation is not a conflict resolution conversation. It is not, there should be no problem solving as part of that
Yeah.
conversation. And I think one mistake that people make is they do a lot of good thinking and then they go in and they think they have their solution and they go in to propose a
Yeah.
solution and the other person says, well, no, and then they're all off to the
Yeah.
races again. There's a conversation that needs to happen before that. And that is this recalibration conversation where you're talking about the kinds of things I just described with that workplace team, where they're talking about how we deliberately or inadvertently exclude people, especially for
Yeah.
people for whom fellowship is very important.
Yeah.
How do we avoid that? How
Yeah.
and when we can't avoid it, because it's going to happen, we're humans, we make
Yeah.
mistakes,
Yeah.
we don't think about
Yeah.
it. And when it does happen, how are we going to handle it? Those kinds of conversations are incredibly important. But people are so driven to fix that they run really fast through what it's not my term, but I use Sam Kainer's term, the groan zone, that sort
Yeah.
of difficult part of a conflict resolution conversation where it's uncomfortable. So we want to get out of there. So we go straight to fixing because that I
Yeah.
know how to do, especially in the workplace. A
Yeah.
lot of us move up in the workplace because we are good problem solvers. So I'm going to get to it. But we don't position the problem solving particularly well when we haven't had this recalibration conversation first.
So the recalibration conversation then is really understanding the core conflict hooks here, understanding what's going on, and then trying to figure out, well, what does the team need to do to fix the future, if you want to call it that.
Mm.
And that's where we kind of go, oh, well, this is what we've learned from this, and this is as our dynamic. This is what we're going to learn to do differently with this dynamic, and now in future, this is how we're going to operate differently or communicate differently. Or is that the general sense of those
Yeah, that's
recalibration?
where we start with the recalibration conversation where we explore these things that this is sort of
Yeah,
deeply about for us. And I don't mean
yeah,
like deep psychological, got to tell them everything,
yeah,
but deeper than just the surface problems.
yeah,
And then we can move into the problem solving conversation. Okay,
yeah,
given all of these things,
yeah,
now how do we use that knowledge
yeah.
to prevent these kinds of problems from continuing or recurring, and how we're going to deal with them if they do?
So
Yep.
when it comes to cognitive reappraisals, then, or
Cognitive reappraisal is just a fancy way of saying finding a different way to think about something.
mm,
So there are lots of different methods for cognitive reappraisal. One of the things that I talk about a lot are the idea that we all have mental models for how we
yeah,
navigate the world. A lot of people have a mental model, for example, that there are difficult people, right?
yeah,
That they're out there, and sometimes we have the misfortune of interacting with them.
yeah,
I don't have the mental model of difficult people, um, and our mental models are just frameworks, are just ways we think about the world and think about the people in it and think about problems and solving problems. And there are a million different possible frameworks. And so cognitive reappraisal is really just finding other ways to understand, help our minds and our hearts understand what we're experiencing. And so it's just saying, I'm going to choose a different mental model to think about this. So conflict hooks are a mental model, pivots are a mental model, stuck stories are a mental model. And there are lots of other ways to understand what's happening. Interests, for example, in interest based negotiation. So there
yeah,
are lots of different mental models, and cognitive reappraisal is just being methodical and thoughtful about understanding that there are lots of ways to understand what I just experienced or what I have been experiencing with this person for the last 2 years. And that when we have a wider array, a wider toolbox of mental models, I sort of think of it as like sports sunglasses. So if I'm kayaking, I'm popping the lenses out of my sports sunglasses, and I'm putting in a lens that will be useful for seeing this. New Hampshire has many, many lakes, and they all are filled with granite boulders. Except for the really deep ones. So if you're kayaking on a river, you're going to smack into a lot of boulders. But if you can wear a certain type of lens, then you're going to be able to see the glare of the sun is going to
yeah,
be pushed away, and you can see the boulders before you hit them. But if I'm hiking on a rainy day, I may be able to choose a different lens that enables me to see in the snow sort of the variations that indicate their roots and things that could trip me up.
Yeah.
So, sports sunglasses have lots of different filters for that reason. And I think of cognitive reappraisal as the act of taking off
Yeah.
one and putting on the other and saying, was this useful? Oh,
Yeah.
well, look at that, right?
Yeah.
I see something I hadn't seen before. And when we have that extra information, then sometimes we unlock something that has been puzzling us that we didn't understand about ourselves or about the other person or about the situation.
So we're coming to the end of our podcast now, Tammy. And if people were to find out more about you and your books, how might they do so?
So the best way is tammylenski.com, spelled just like my name, Tammylen is in negotiation, SKI.com. And that's my home base. You can find my books there. You can find the worksheet that I referenced. If you go to the page for the conflict pivot, there's a link to get that worksheet. You can just download it for free. It's in multiple languages, in French and Spanish and English. My podcast, you can find your way to there. You can find your way to my Substack there, my newsletter. And you can find out more information on these ideas. So that's my home base, and that's the best place to go.
Well, Dr. Tammy Lenski, author of The Conflict Pivot, Turning Conflict into Peace of Mind. Tammy, thank you so much for joining the Workplace Podcast.
William, thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun to talk about the book, and I really appreciate your wonderful questions.
Thanks so much for listening to the Workplace Podcast. I really appreciate you being part of the conversation. If you found value in today's episode and want to support what we're building here, you'll find a link to our Patreon in the description. As a workplace expert, I'm here to help you resolve your workplace dilemmas. If your organization could benefit from my expertise, feel free to get in touch via our website, yellowwood.ie. Yellowwood, your external learning and development partner. Take a different path to success in your career, leadership, team, and organization. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you soon.